Are you interested in improving your flexibility? Well, in this video, I'm going to teach you why stretching may not be the way to accomplish that. My name is Lauren Irk, and I'd like to welcome you to Fitness Integrated Science. If you look at any website or social media that's involved in fitness these days, you're going to see this word called mobility. Mobility training is exploding in our marketplace. But you have to ask ourselves, what is mobility? What is moving? And what in our body actually creates this motion? Well, it's actually the muscles. And if we want to move better, we actually have to improve our muscles' ability to contract better. Then we also have, by contrast, this other word that we hear called stability. We want to improve joint stability. We want to improve the stability of an exercise. Well, stability is actually holding still. What holds us still? Muscles. So whether we're talking about flexibility, range of motion, mobility, stability, all of these words dial down into the health of our muscular system. It is true that as we age, some studies say that as much as 3 to 8% of our muscle mass is decreased every decade that we're alive. If we couple that with a sedentary lifestyle or maybe repetitive activities like hours of cardio or some sort of repetitive sport, we're going to lose certain ranges and our muscles are going to change. Our joint surfaces are even going to change. We only have as much mobility as our body allows for. Now, when we think about this one word that really comes into mind when I think about the idea of being mobile, it's going to be the word structure. If I look at this spine, for instance, you can see that this spine is a pretty funky shape. And if I look at all the individual joints of this spine, we can see that they're not uniform. Each spinal level is going to have its own motion capabilities just determined by their structure. You can absolutely see that as the structures go down, they get bigger. As they go up, they get larger. Some of these spinous processes angle down, some of them angle straight out. The angles of the facets or the spinal joints are all angled differently. So we know that the spine is going to have specific properties of how it moves. By the same token, if I take one individual, maybe this individual has done a rotational sport all their life, or maybe this other individual has sat at a desk all their life. Those two people's spines are going to move differently as they age. Not to mention the genetic factor, which a lot of times really can't even be changed. We just have to adhere for it. If we look at the individual joints of our body, the motions of a hip joint is very different than the motions of a knee joint. And so we have to make sure that our exercise choices don't violate our natural ability to move. That being said, how do I improve flexibility? How do I gain flexibility? There are 3 exercises that I'm going to show you, going to give you a little bit of a fix that might switch some of the ideas in your head. Number 1 is the old hamstring tightness. Let's say that I can't sit with my legs out in front of me because my hamstrings are pulling so tight. Remember what I said about what mobility is. If I want to move better into this position, I've got to improve the contraction of my muscles. So if you look at me sitting like this, you can see that actually the hamstrings are not doing this motion. This position that I had to get into, this motion that I got into, was actually hip flexion. And these muscles have to hold me here for me to be able to sit in this position. The muscles that I need to focus on are not the hamstring. The muscles that I need to focus on are actually here at the front of the hip because they need to be able to shorten adequately for me to sit at a 90-degree angle on the floor. So instead of coming down onto my back and trying to forcibly stretch my hamstrings, which in actuality are tightening up because I don't have enough ability to contract here, I want to switch things. So instead of putting my hands here and pulling, I actually want to place my hands on the other side and do the same motion but against my hands. Can you see that when my hands are here and they're pulling, The muscles are just kind of going along for the ride, and we're hoping that if we stretch this tissue, that somehow it's going to remain that way when we're done. It didn't do anything to improve the contractibility of these muscles here in the front of the hip. But if I just, in the same motion, block it with my hands, now I've got this very important principle of biomechanics called resistance. And in resistance, there has to be opposition. By my hands being here and me pulling my leg into my hands, now the muscles in the front of my hip that actually perform this joint motion, we're going to call them collectively our hip flexor muscles, they actually have a reason to shorten. They have a resistance. They feel it. And when I move my leg into my hand, I can feel these muscles squeezing. And guess what? Over time, as I do these types of exercises or squats or any type of hip flexion exercise, when these muscles get stronger, guess what happens to the hamstrings? They won't need to tighten as much so that I can go into these types of issues. For my second exercise, I want to show you the Cobra or the back bend. How many times have you heard that when I have a herniated disc or a backward bend that I should lie down on my stomach, push into the floor, and move myself into a backward bend? You saw this spine. Where do you think a lot of this motion is going to come from? Probably right about here. Over here, won't go any more except for maybe a straight line. And if I don't have a lot of motion at that lumbar region, due to my previous health history, I'm not going to have a lot of ability to move. So instead of pushing yourself into the floor, using your arms and letting your torso just sort of go along for the ride, I'm going to use good old gravity that's sitting right on top of me to tell me how much range I actually have. So bringing your arms to your sides, looking at the floor, first of all, decide, am I actually able to come off the floor at all? I might have to put a blanket under my hips to make that happen. Otherwise, all I'm going to do is move my upper body off the floor as much as it can. Some people the first day can get way up off the floor. I know this from teaching yoga for so many decades. And some people can practice this for decades and barely get off the floor. So our mobility has everything to do with the muscles that cross the spinal column that actually move me into that backward bend. Lastly, I want to show you the old quadricep stretch. So when people are doing these types of stretches, you see them before a run, grab their foot and pull, trying to stretch the front of their leg. Or you see them going into these sort of hip flexor stretches all over social media where they're pushing their hip forward in an attempt to stretch the front of the hip. And they think to themselves, if I could only get these muscles to lengthen and get longer, I'm not going to feel pain in my lower back. But again, if you look at this position, what is creating this joint motion? What is shortening? This is actually having to adapt or get a little, the fibers have to get further apart or elongate, right? The tightening is actually happening here on the back of the hip. So again, here's that same action. Instead of stretching the front of the hip, I want to think of contracting the back of the hip. The more that I can get the muscles back here to shorten and tighten, the more length or the more mobility that I'm going to get into my hip. So a better action might be to engage the glute by pulling the legs towards each other, pushing the leg forward and pulling the forward leg back, or simply going back down into some of these prone exercises and just working on strengthening the glute. The stronger these muscles get, the better able they are at contracting. In actuality, I'm going to feel less of a pull in the front of the hip, and that may be the very thing that releases our back and makes our spine, our lower back, not be quite so painful. So when we think about mobility, remember, it's the muscles that create mobility. And if we want our mobility to change, we need to improve our muscles' ability to contract and shorten so that we actually have better muscle balance and less pain. If you would like more information about this, all kinds of exercise videos that give you examples that you can feel right inside of your body, head on over to Fitness Integrated Science TV. where I have a whole program that is built around this principle. Sign up for my free newsletter, and most importantly, share this video with your friends so that we can get this message out to more people. Thanks for watching.